So you can't talk about climate without talking about climate finance. So our next session will be with our partner CGAP on unlocking climate finance. And I'll introduce the stage, my colleague Alan Robbins, to lead that discussion.
Well, thank you, Kate. And I'm going to turn around and introduce Sophie Sirtaine, who is CEO of CGAP. Please have a seat. Kate, you stole my words a little bit there, which is, that was such a great conversation about sort of all the things that we need to do to safeguard the future for our next generations. But finance is such a huge part of that, and climate finance is such a huge part of that. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. CGAP is, you're almost 30 years old. So next year is 30th anniversary. So you've been a leader in the financial inclusion space throughout that time. One might say you were in financial inclusion before financial inclusion was cool, right? But through that time, it's evolved quite a bit. Can you talk a bit about CGAP's current thinking on financial inclusion and its engagement with climate finance and adaptation in particular?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, to invite me to talk about such an important topic. So fundamentally, if you listen to global climate conversations today, you're going to hear a very strong focus on financial targets. And of course, that's critically important, but we think there's a massive gap in those conversations, which is around how we're going to ensure that that funding is going to reach the hands of those who need it the most. If you think about numbers, we have about $4.8 trillion that's been channeled into climate finance so far, but it is estimated that only 10% of that has actually reached local levels. And we fundamentally think that that's a massive problem, because what we should aim to do is first to ensure that those who suffer the most from the impact of climate change, including low-income households in developing countries, are equipped with more and better solutions to build their resilience and adapt. And second, that we also need to ensure grassroots action against a warming climate by facilitating access to greener technologies. That's really the just transition angle. We need to make sure that low-income families don't get left behind as all of us, the rest of the world, benefits from cleaner, greener technologies. And that's where financial inclusion, if you want, inclusive finance comes in. And that's why we're so actively working on this. Because it is an industry that can become a vehicle to channel large amount of climate finance directly into the hands of their existing billions of low-income customers. And we think that matters not just because, of course, that would improve the livelihoods and resilience of these people, but fundamentally because it would enhance climate action globally. And that's in the interest of everybody, including what the previous panel was talking about, future generation and the sustainability of our world.
So with climate finance is often B's are thrown around for billions and T's are thrown around for trillions. And I find that sometimes that might dissuade. I saw one number that was by 2031, we'll need to spend $10 trillion a year on fighting the climate crisis. And I think that might sometimes dissuade individuals, organizations. You look at it, rather than that top-down perspective, say, we need to find $10 trillion, you're looking at it more from the bottom-up perspective, right? That individuals, as long as we can include those individuals, that will help. So can you talk about how financial inclusion turns into climate finance?
Yes. So very concretely, what that would look like is that you have an existing ecosystem of inclusive financial services providers that presents a high impact, low risk opportunity, underexploited opportunity to channel climate finance at the grassroots. We're not saying that should replace how climate finance is channeled today, right? Global climate funds, large multilateral institutions, they play a fantastic role, and that needs to continue. but they struggle in getting to the last mile. And if you think about numbers again, the disbursement of adaptation bilateral funding is 66% compared to 98% for ODA in general. So that shows that they really struggle to disburse at the grassroots, especially for adaptation. By contrast, the ecosystem of inclusive finance providers are a set of regulated institutions that are used to channeling public and private funding, including from capital markets and from donors, at scale. So they've raised billions of dollars over the last decades. They meet fiduciary standards. They meet procurement standards. Many of them are Paris aligned. And most importantly, what they do fundamentally is take big tickets of funding. So we're thinking they should do that with climate funding, big tickets of climate fundings, and they channel that into small tickets directly into the hands of low-income populations and micro firms with a tradition of high impact, focusing on outcomes, as the previous panel said, and reporting, be accountable for that impact. So maybe just to give you an example of what that would look like in practice, let's take BRAC, which is a very well-known microfinance institution in Bangladesh. They serve millions of customers. They're funded from both public and private sources, including capital markets funding. And what they've offered over the last few years is a contingent credit lines by which they pre-approve low-income individuals for withdrawing on a pre-approved credit line when a flood index triggers. Obviously, flooding increases in intensity and frequency in Bangladesh due to climate change. And so that is like an insurance, but without a premium. And it is like a credit, but without the waste time to apply. It's pre-approved. And that is reaching millions of customers with tiny disbursement funded by large amounts of funding.
So, microfinance and microcredit, that's very much the roots of CGAP, and they still play a big role in this evolution, even though, it's not trillions, certainly, but it helps to get to those trillions. How about let's talk a bit about social protection systems and the role that they play there. They're often so lacking. How can financial services really help to strengthen those to help people adapt to the challenges ahead?
Yeah. Before I talk about that, I want to say that it's not just microfinance we're talking about. I want to make sure people understand that when we talk about inclusive financial providers, it's much, 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 much more than microfinance. Microfinance is important and can play a big role, but it's also fintechs, mobile money providers, banks, even manufacturers that pair with digital banks, etc. I'm happy to give you more examples if you want later. And it's also not just adaptation. It's also mitigation. We can finance the adoption, for instance, of green cook stove or other green solutions at a low cost today. But social safety nets, to come back to your question, do play a very important role. They're a very important part of the puzzle. So thank you for that question. Because there will always be some risk at the tail end of climate disasters and some very low-income people for which social safety nets will be the only solution. And social safety nets are also a channel to a vehicle to channel large amounts of donor funding directly into the hands of low-income people. They're typically funded by bilateral donors or MDBs. But again, we're coming back to inclusive finance. We think inclusive finance can enhance the effectiveness of social safety nets. And I'll give you a few ways that can happen. First, it can accelerate payments, because if you channel social safety net payments directly into the mobile money of a recipient, it can be transferred in seconds. And of course, that has happened during COVID. No, it needs to happen for climate transfers as well. Secondly, inclusive finance can even be linked, for instance, so a transfer on a cell phone could even be linked to an early warning system to do what is called now anticipatory payments, meaning you disburse even before a disaster strike, so that you enable adaptation, mitigation measures, and you reduce the impact of the shock. And that's extremely important. And now we can do that 3 days ahead of a shock. But they are tech companies that are trying to get to high level of predictability 5 days in advance. Now, inclusive finance can also help take risk away from public purses. And we all know that fiscal constraints are very strong in today's world in many developing countries. And so if you link, for instance, a microinsurance scheme with a social safety net payment, UNCDF is piloting that in the Pacific, for instance. It can disburse at the time of a shock ahead of the social safety net. So de facto, it takes away part of the risk and puts it in the insurance or reinsurance market. So there's a very strict, very strong role for social safety nets, but they need to be fit for purpose. And in that, for climate, and in that context, I think inclusive finance can play a key role as well.
Great. Well, thank you. I think that's a really good call to action here for all of us, and a really useful way of seeing that, we don't have to just think the trillions. We can think, the one person at a time to get this. Sophie, thank you so much. I know this is the second time you've been on stage at Devex, so we appreciate your time. We appreciate your partnership for this event and ongoing as well. And please join me in thanking Sophie.
Thank you.